Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk about the Stoic conception of philosophy. Stoicism, as a philosophical school, developed in what we call the Hellenistic period. That word, Hellenistic, comes from the word that the Greeks used to describe themselves, Hellene, and it's much like the word realistic. You would never go outside and describe trees as realistic, you would just call them real. Meanwhile, if you saw the graphics of a really high quality video game, you might describe those graphics as realistic because you're denying that they are real, but you're saying that they look real. Similarly, when we call something Hellenistic, we're saying that it's not really Hellenic, but it looks Hellenic, Hellenistic. And that's because at the end of the preceding period, the classical period, the Greeks were conquered by the Macedonians. Philip II in the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC conquered Greece. And later, his son Alexander dies the end of the 320s BC. And when Alexander the Great dies, the Greeks are firmly conquered. They rise up briefly and they ultimately lose, and their defeat is finalized in that short war. When the Macedonians conquered ancient Greece, they destroyed some of the most cherished Greek institutions, especially the independence of the Greek city state, the polis. The Greeks had fiercely fought to maintain and defend their independence against other threats. External threats like the Persians, internal threats like the Athenians, the Thebans at different points in Greek history. But when the Macedonians conquered them, first under Philip II and then again under Alexander the Great's general, and when they briefly rose up after Alexander's death, their defeat is finalized in a way that ensures they'll never have their independence again. In the loss of that independence, Hellenistic philosophy develops, and so too with it, Stoic philosophy. Now, Stoicism isn't coming out of nowhere. It develops out of the classical theories of philosophy and schools of philosophy, chiefly those developed by Plato, Aristotle, Heraclitus, and so on. But despite its clear provenance in classical Greek philosophy, Stoicism is firmly Hellenistic. That is to say, it's a response to some deep existential problems felt and faced by Greek people. Later, of course, Stoicism moves to the Roman Empire where it changes. And today, Stoicism still exists, and Stoics today feel a different sense of priorities. They feel a different sense of urgent crises they're responding to. But that says something very important about where Stoicism came from. Stoicism came from a moment when the Greeks had lost what was so important to them and what, frankly, they never thought they would lose. When we read the Stoic predecessors, such as Plato and Aristotle, we find in them deep reflections on life in a polis, what we might call political life, as something that they thought would never end. But when the Greeks lose their independence, when the Greek states lose their independence, they do lose this important part of their identity and what it means to be a Greek. Stoicism is very much a response to that. And just as much as people from particular states, polis, just as much as people from particular states cannot identify in the same way that their ancestors could have identified with that particular polis. Instead, Greek schools of philosophy become something of a source of identity, something to rally around. And so people in this period would identify as members of the Stoic school or some rival school like the Epicureans or the Academy, Plato's Academy, or Aristotle's school, which eventually became called the Peripatetics. People chose these philosophical schools as a source of identity for themselves. And in this context, we have the Stoic philosophers reflect very profoundly on what philosophy is. And so very early on in in Stoic philosophy, we get these explicit reflections. For example, Zeno of Citium, who was teaching in Athens around 300 BC, he in his text on rational discourses, which no longer survives to us, but we have reports, we have him dividing philosophy into three parts: the study of nature, physics, the study of logic, and the study of how to live well, ethics. There's no room for metaphysics in the Stoic conception of philosophy because they think that reality basically consists in corporeal things. Corporeal things are the only things that exist. These would be bodily, physical things that could act on something else or could be acted upon. The Stoics do believe that there are a few incorporeal things: time, place, void, and sayables. What sometimes people will just leave untranslated in Greek as lecta. These would be something like the meanings of our utterances, the meanings of words, but sayables is traditionally how we translate the word lecta if we're going to translate at all. And these incorporeal things are literally the only things that don't exist. Sorry, these are the only things that are not corporeal but still exist. In fact, they don't really exist; they merely subsist. So their existence is entirely dependent on corporeal things that do have full-fledged existence. The Stoics, as a matter of fact, maintain that God exists and maintain the soul exists, but they think that the God and the soul are actually just two corporeal things, corporeal, physical, bodily things. But reality is summed up basically by corporeal things. And if we wanted to be precise, these four incorporeal things: time, place, void, and sayables. And for that reason, they don't have metaphysics as a distinct branch of philosophy because physics exhausts the study of the natural world, of the things that exist, of the things that exist. Um, and they begin to reflect consciously on what the relationship is between these parts. So, for example, some Stoics compared philosophy to a living thing. Logic is the bones and the sinews, ethics is the fleshier parts, and physics is the soul. Now, some Stoics use the same image, but they described a different relationship. The Stoic Posidonius, for example, says that physics is the blood and the flesh, logic is the bones, and ethics is the soul. Still, other Stoics compared philosophy to an egg. Logic is the outside, ethics is what comes next, and physics is the innermost parts. Other Stoics likened philosophy to a fertile field. The walls were like logic, the land or trees like physics, and the fruit of those trees were like ethics. Further, Stoics liken philosophy to a city that's well fortified and governed according to reason. Now, the proliferation of these images reflects disagreements between the Stoics themselves. For instance, the reason why Posidonius preferred the image of a living animal over the fertile field is that the parts of a living animal are inseparable from each other, whereas the walls of a field are separable from the field's trees and fruits. He didn't think that the parts of philosophy were separable from each other, and for that reason, he preferred his own image. So it's natural to wonder which of the images is the best or the most accurate, but all of them stress different things. And probably the best, most illustrative example of this fact is the fertile field image. As physics is doing its thing, logic is there to protect it. And that's why logic is likened to the wall around the field. The trees or the land is physics because these things give birth to the fruits, which are ethics. So, as logic is doing its protective work around physics, physics is doing its job, which is yielding ethics. So, what that's supposed to get across is the way that we undertake logic for the sake of physics and physics for the sake of ethics. Presumably, though, logic is also good for ethics because logic helps you reason well. But the idea is that there's a relationship of instrumentality there, that all of this is for the sake of ethics or living well. Um, the egg example is similar in the way that logic is protective. But the point is that these images proliferate because there are so many small, subtle disagreements about the images. The whole point of all of the images, though, is one way or another to get across the importance of ethics and the way that the other parts of philosophy are not disjointed from or not disconnected from ethics. That's why Posidonius's view that the parts of philosophy are inseparable from each other and we need an image that reflects that. That's why that point is so important. We do logic to learn how to reason well, and physics to help us learn about the world around us, and then ethics to give us a sense of where we fit into that picture and how our living well requires us to, in one way or another, live according to nature. But it is helpful to note how much the Stoics disagree with each other. And as I've said a few times now, the proliferation of images is meant to reflect that. Stoicism, for example, as a philosophical movement or a school of thought, began around the year 300 with Zeno of Citium, who was born around 10 years after Plato's death and about 10 years before Aristotle's death. It began in Athens, but eventually became popular in the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire. And its heyday in antiquity ended around the 300s AD. But even today, there are people who identify as Stoics and not just talking about Stoic beliefs, but who actually live as the Stoics recommended. And that's because, at least partly because, the Stoics developed a philosophy that people from any time or period or social background could learn from. But it's also partly because Stoicism was very flexible. And what I mean by that is that we can learn something from the fact that ancient Athenian philosophers like Zeno of Citium were Stoics. A Roman slave named Epictetus was a Stoic. And the word Epictetus or epiktetos in ancient Greek literally means possession, possessed one, property. And the Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic. Stoicism has something for everyone, whether you were an ancient Athenian whose cherished institutions just vanished, or a slave, or the emperor of Rome. But Stoicism does change every time it changes hands. That adaptability is crucial. And we see this when we observe subtle disagreements between the Stoics, who mean different things by some of these words. Now, sadly, we don't have as many Stoic texts as we'd like, not even close, really. I've mentioned Posidonius, for example, and he was very clearly a very influential Stoic, but we don't have any text today that he wrote. I could tell you about his view of the parts of philosophy only because a sentence or two about his thoughts are reported to us in a much later text, a much later philosopher, Sextus Empiricus in this case, who wasn't a Stoic himself. And I rely on ancient biographers like Diogenes Laertius to tell me about the other Stoic thoughts about the images of philosophy. So we have to rely on these important sources to give us information about the Stoic philosophers and their thoughts about philosophy. But all of these are topics we can consider in future episodes as well. But this suffices for our look today at the Stoic conception of philosophy in a very general, basic way. Thank you.